And welcome, everybody. I'm really glad to have you here today. I know it's kind of late in the afternoon for some of us, and some of us have been attending these webinars all day long, but that makes me doubly appreciative that you've chosen to show up here today as well. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about something that I call accessibility theft, and the name is designed to be evocative, but uh, what it means at the end of the day is that there are vendors out there who are actively pushing off their accessibility debt onto your shoulders and the shoulders of your learners. And I'm going to try to give you some tools today to prevent that from happening, or at least to minimize the impact of accessibility theft when it does occur. Before I get started, I just wanted to share a little bit of a story to say why this matters to me to begin with. As a blind person and a person who's been in the corporate world for a long time, I've sat through plenty of e-learning activities that are completely inaccessible. Um, I remember a time back when I had started working at Wells Fargo in 2014. I was at a call center in Salem, Oregon, and I was super excited to be working there. It was for the area and for the time, it was a good paying job, and I was excited to be working with a team of 20 other people who had started training at the same time. Now, I got there to day one of training, and they already had my workstation set up with Zoom Text, which is a screen magnification and reader tool, and they had all of my accommodations in place. But after about a week of in-person instructor-led training, we got to that favorite part of everyone's onboarding where we had to sit down at the computer and do some compliance training. And we all know how fun compliance training is to begin with, but now imagine trying to do that on a screen with a assistive technology. And then imagine that the e-learning course that you're trying to use to learn about compliance, to learn all of the specific things that you have to know to do your job, isn't accessible even to your assistive technology. That's exactly what happened to me. Um, so disclosure is a topic in the disability community that is probably deserves its own webinar. But basically, I had to go and disclose to my trainer that this accessibility or the accessibility of this software just wasn't working for me. And then I had to explain what that even meant because they thought as long as I had Zoom text, I should be able to do my course. Like that was the accommodation that was approved. That's what HR had given them, and I had to explain that even though I had this assistive technology in place, the content itself still needs to basically be compatible, and it wasn't. My trainer was really great, though. He was super willing to find a solution, and what we were eventually able to come up with was that we had one of our banker coaches, which is basically like um, a senior employee who was there to help train new recruits. The banker coach was to sit down next to me and read everything on the screen and click all of my buttons for me and not interfere with my learning and understanding. So I was to tell them what I wanted them to click, especially when it came time to do knowledge checks or drag and drop games. But they were going to do all of the manual part. What ended up happening was I spent an extra week worth of time doing this because the process was long and slow. I was a week later than all of my peers to our on-the-job training. And more importantly, they were not only paying me to be unproductive, they were paying a banker coach, a senior employee, their higher wage to sit next to me and click buttons. Their lost productivity cost the company far more money than my lost productivity, but combined, we spent probably the equivalent of an annual Articulate 360 subscription uh, in just lost wages. That's not to even mention the customers we weren't helping, the products we weren't selling, all of the different impacts of this decision to have e-learning in the format that it was ended up costing the company quite a lot of money. Um, Now, imagine yourself in the position of the e-learning instructor, the developer rather. Um, you hadn't set out with the goal of making somebody's life miserable. You didn't intend to cost the company a ton of money when you built this compliance training. You were just using the tools that were handed to you to make the courses that you knew you needed to make. And accessibility often is not even part of the conversation, or if it is, you rely on the good faith word of these tools that their content is going to be accessible when it's output. I'm thinking nowadays we have tools like Articulate Rise, which um, I don't want to pick on Articulate too heavily, but Rise is often seen as being the accessible alternative to a lot of tools, and people have given it a reputation for being accessible out of the box. But that's not 100% of the case. Yes, it does produce more accessible and compliant content right away, with less effort on the developer's part, but it's not perfect. And there are other tools that are entering the market and tools that have been on the market, incumbents that have been here for a long time that are even less accessible than Rise. And somewhere, at some point, a um, a procurement team had chosen to buy those tools for the department that built the e-learning, that then passed that e-learning onto their teams of disabled people who couldn't use the tools that they have, uh, finally to complete their training. Uh, it's kind of like one of those games where you follow the consequences up the line all the way to the root, and what we find is it was a vendor's decision to sell this product to begin with accessibility features that were either non-existent or non-compliant. That was in 2014, so the accessibility landscape back then was a little different, but it's still just as bad today in many ways. And with the advent of AI and the vibe coding becoming what it is, it's more important than ever that we equip ourselves with tools to avoid this sort of issue. Now, with the advent of all of these new tools comes a lot of these ed tech platforms that are trying to sell into the market, and they know that the game is to provide an accessibility conformance report or voluntary product accessibility template. And that gets by the procurement teams, it gets through the procurement police, and you're able to sell your tool to a e-learning team that then uses that to develop content. Um, but I'll show you in a little bit here why that doesn't necessarily solve the problem all of the time. Before I do that, I just wanted to kind of get a feel for the room. Um, if you've ever had somebody tell you to just make it accessible, go ahead and drop a number one in the chat. Yeah, yeah, we're getting a lot of ones. Now, in addition to that, if you've ever spent like a lot of time fighting with an authoring tool to try to make it accessible when uh, maybe it hasn't been as easy, go ahead and drop a number two. And I'm talking about things like having to remove rectangles from focus order or not knowing where to find the alt text feature to add alt text to an image. Yeah, yeah, we're getting a lot of twos as well. So most of you have experienced this frustration in one way or another. That does not surprise me at all because the tools that we're using are often not accessibility compliant. And it's even worse from the authoring perspective, but when they don't make accessibility easy for you, um, they're actively harming your experience. So imagine me being that person sitting in a chair trying to take an instructional design or trying to take an e-learning course and not being able to access it. That's because upstream, somebody had uh, used tools that themselves were not accessible, right? Um, now imagine if the tools that you were using were purchased for you because a vendor claimed that they were accessible. Or imagine that somebody upstream had made the statement at one point, accessibility isn't for us. We don't have disabled learners. Why do we need to do that? It's too expensive. Drop a three in the chat if you've heard any of those things before. Yeah, a lot of threes coming in. When somebody upstream says something like that, that makes a real impact on product decisions. They build tools that aren't accessible by default. They sell tools that aren't accessible by default. That's called accessibility debt when it's a form of technical debt, meaning they're taking what could be built in as a feature and pushing it off till later. That later eventually comes due, whether that's to the team that is the product team that builds the tools, the legal team that has to defend against a lawsuit, or downstream to the team that's actually building with those tools. Somebody pays that accessibility debt. And oftentimes that's you, the designer, and your learners. And I call that accessibility theft because somebody else's decision took that accessibility, that time, that energy, that effort, those resources away from you and away from your learners and away from the companies that you're designing for. They made a decision that influenced how deeply somebody is able to engage with the content that you're building. Or they made a decision upstream somewhere that made it frustrating or difficult for you to use your tools as effectively as you know they need to be used. That's why I'm kind of up in arms about this topic lately because it drives me wild that we have up till 2026 allowed vendors to get away with this. Oftentimes, there's something called an accessibility conformance report, or colloquially, it's sometimes called a VPAT, which is the product accessibility template. When a vendor or a product designer builds a tool that they want to sell off to government organizations, nonprofit institutions, colleges, they create this accessibility conformance report that says how much their platform complies with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They'll publish these statements on their website, and oftentimes a procurement team at one of these universities or government organizations or even enterprises now, um, they look at these ACRs and they say, oh, the vendor has one. We can now move forward with our request for proposal, the process to purchase that vendor's tools. Uh, a lot of the times, the ACR is never actually looked at. And if it is, it's never actually tested, durably tested by somebody at the procuring organization. We take vendors at their word. But I've been reviewing a lot of these lately. If you've been following my Substack, you'll have seen some recent examples of this. Uh, I'll tell you right now, a lot of those accessibility conformance reports, the claims that they make don't match up to reality. Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes they've been the product teams have been alerted to the issue and they do get on board with making fixes. So sometimes it's unintentional. But whether or not it's intentional, the impact is the same. They're selling tools that are not accessible to teams that need them to be. And I don't want you to be left holding the bag because it's you and your learners who end up suffering when these decisions are made, oftentimes in rooms that you're not even involved with. So, how do we protect ourselves? If we're not the ones actually procuring those tools, and unless you're a solopreneur or an independent freelancer, you might not be. You might only have access to the tools that your organization has provided to you. Well, there are a few things that we can do. Um, First, we can start gathering data. We can test the tools for ourselves and learn how to push back. So a lot of times, when a procurement team, I see this in the chat where a lot of procurement teams don't even have this expertise, and that's true. Our procurement teams also need to be given the tools that they need to test these issues. And I'm going to show you some tools that are so simple, so easy to test, um, that it can catch a lot of accessibility issues without needing any specialized expertise. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit more about how we how we go about influencing those decisions when we're not the ones who are making them. As we are testing, we need to collect data about our own experiences. And as often as possible, we need to collect user data, which is kind of difficult to do sometimes. And also, we know that data doesn't always tell the strongest story. So there are two types of data we need to gather, the quantitative data and the qualitative data. Everybody has heard the data point that 1 in 4 adults worldwide has a disability. That's a statistic. That's qualitative data. And that very rarely changes people's minds when it comes to making purchase decisions. But if you listen to my story about my time at Wells Fargo and the issues that I had during onboarding, if you share the dollar amounts or the lost productivity in real world terms, those stories pack a lot of weight. So one of the things that you can do to start collecting these data, is to document your own tests, but also to drop a survey or to drop a question in your surveys at the end of your e-learning experiences. We all love to gather information about our surveys, but I don't think I've sat through one corporate training one time that has asked the question, was this course accessible to you with or without assistive technology? Stop me if you have heard something like that, or if you have seen something like that on a corporate survey. I don't think I have. But that opens the door for learners to tell you whether or not the training was accessible. I know I have given feedback in the extra comment section about accessibility before, but nobody ever acts on that feedback. But if you can start gathering data up front about people's experiences, that's a place where you can start to gather up all of that information that you can then pass upstream to the people who are responsible for making those decisions. And then when you start to ask about accessibility during these surveys, you can start to gather real world feedback. You can ask in long form questions for people to tell you what their actual experiences were like. None of this requires any sort of uh, additional expertise. And I see this note about HIPAA violations. It's interesting. There are people who are much more sensitive to HIPAA possible regulation violations than I am. Knowing what I know about HIPAA, and I've been through plenty of HIPAA training in my life. If you ask a simple question like, "Was this course accessible to you with or without assistive technology?" That's not asking anybody to disclose medical information. That's simply asking if it's accessible to them, and that can mean any wide range of things. So I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a specialist, but to me, that type of question is um, a little bit more inviting than maybe asking somebody to disclose specifically what issues that they were having, because I know that that can be a violation as well. So, in addition to gathering information, I said that we can do a little bit of hands-on testing ourselves, and this is something that you can do to test your own designs. You can do to um, create trainings to show your procurement teams how to test some of the designs, how to test anything before it's pushed out to the end user. So what I'm going to do really quickly here is drop a link in the chat. And this is going to ask you for your name and email address. That is all optional, so feel free to just click continue. Just part of the workflow. Um, if you click continue, I just get anonymous data. You're not required to share anything that you don't want to. I'm going to also share my screen here real quick. Um, can everybody see my screen?
Hi, Jacob. We can see it. I want to add some real quick also in the chat area. When you shared the initial link, you shared it to just hosts and panelists.
Oh,
Um,
whoops.
but I went ahead and I copied it and I shared it to everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
So we're going to just briefly go through a couple of interactions here. I'd like you to put your keyboards away. Well, or I'm sorry, not your keyboards. Put your mice away while you do this. Um, I do not have my audio shared because I'm not testing for screen reader functionality specifically here. So if you've been through some of my demos before, you'll know how much I love to share my screen reader audio, but that's not what we're doing in this particular case. We're just going to show you some keyboard only testing. I'm going to continue into the course. And you don't necessarily have to read through this first page. If you ever did decide that you wanted to come back here and review all of this on your own, this was built in a way that you can follow along with or without me present to guide you through it. But I am going to just skip to module 2. What I did is I just pressed the tab key because when I loaded this course, my keyboard focus was automatically set to the heading 1 at the top of the page, which is something that I advocate for in any of these types of e-learning courses when possible, because skipping past all of the navigation at the beginning of the content just saves users on a lot of clicks. So I hit tab and I'm going to press enter to activate this button to take me to module 2. And this is where I actually would like you all to play around a little bit. So using your tab key on the keyboard and the enter key, as well as the space bar, you can move through this course and kind of try to interact with some of the things. If you need to go backward, use Shift and Tab. That will take you backward to a focusable element, and again, Tab will take you forward to the next focusable element. If I press Tab, for example, I get to this accordion that says, "Why does this matter in practice?" I can press Enter to expand, and I can read that, or I can press Enter to collapse it. If I press Tab again, it takes me into the activity. And this is a typical kind of drag and drop activity. Now, if you were using your mouse, it should work. I've not actually tested it with a mouse, so I apologize if it doesn't. But give it a try with your keyboard. And if somebody can let me know whether they're able to successfully complete this with using the keyboard, not tabbing for you with your keyboard. Is it not tabbing into anything at all, Nicole? Yeah, there are spots where the mouse won't land. Not able to get to the activity. Not tabbing to the cards at all. Interesting. I am not having that issue. Um, I don't know if you can see the focus activity on my uh yeah, that's okay. Um, so I think you are all spotting an issue that I baked into this. You might not be able to see the focus indicator. That is an issue that you want to note um, when you're evaluating a tool. If the focus indicator isn't visible, you can't necessarily see whether you're actually in the activity. Now, imagine a keyboard-only user who never gets to use a mouse that can't do that. That can't tell which spot they're on. If you all tab like many times, you might be able to get down to the Submit Answers button. Yeah. Now, if you press Submit Answers, I just pressed Submit Answers on my screen, and some feedback popped up. But I'm a screen reader user, and I can't read that feedback because it didn't take focus and it didn't announce itself to me. Oh no, I don't know why it didn't load for you. Hmm. Is anybody else having that issue? Okay. Now, as I'm tabbing through these different cards, you've all noted that there is no focus indicator. It takes a lot of tabbing to kind of move around. If you press the space bar to try to pick one of them up, um, it might show you that you've highlighted something or that you've selected something, but I'll spoiler alert now, you won't be able to drag and drop these. Uh, this was a very common drag and drop pattern. Um, I think I've met maybe one or two drag and drop games in my lifetime that have been fully keyboard accessible. Yes, it feels like when you add something to a Word document and your cursor gets hidden behind the image. That's exactly right. It's hard to know what you're even looking at. Now, there is a button that says click here to um, for the keyboard accessible version of the interaction, but I deliberately wired that button in a way that makes it inaccessible to keyboard focus. So um, you can't actually tab to it. That's also a common feature. If you are tabbing through a course and it skips over a button, and you can see that button on the page, but the keyboard won't land on it, that's probably because it's not actually a button. It's something else that's wired up to look like a button. That's exactly what we did here. The other thing that you can do, and none of this costs you anything to do, you just set your mouse aside and started pressing the tab key a bunch. Another thing that you can do with your keyboard is zoom in to 200%. With Windows on Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome, you can hold Control and press the plus key, and that will zoom you in a little bit at a time. I'm sorry, I don't know what that command might be on Mac. Um, but if you go to your browser toolbar settings and press the zoom button, you can zoom to 200% and see what else might fail on the screen. If some of the content, Command plus, okay, perfect. If some of the content goes missing, then yeah, we notice that there are a few things that happen here. The feedback is in a weird spot, and some of the content gets cut off. This is also very common, especially with e-learning activities that are built to be pixel perfect. So we spend a lot of time dragging and dropping things around the screen and kind of a PowerPoint style interface where we want everything to be um, just the way that the designer intended. But your audience isn't always going to interact with your content in the way that you intended. And if it ends up being uh, designed in such a way that it's not flexible enough to support um, the user's assistive technology or their plain Zoom settings, then it might break. This is another, again, a common thing that e-learning vendors will build into their tools by mistake. It's accessibility debt. Excuse me. And when you can't control this, because oftentimes these sort of viewport issues are not something that you have any sort of control over yourself. With designing drag and drop activities, you can decide not to use drag and drop. With buttons, there's almost every single tool has a way to include an actual button instead of a fake button. But when it comes to changing your zoom levels, um, you may not be able to control the way that the software manages that. That data is really important to give to whoever it is that might need to hear it in order uh, to change their mind on whether or not to continue using these tools. If your procurement team is in the process of evaluating software, then they need to consider that a giant red flag and not continue. Even more so, if the accessibility conformance report doesn't say anything about any of these issues, but you've managed to find them here in 5 minutes, that's another red flag. So the accessibility conformance report needs to be an honest evaluation of the platform, and it needs to point out all of the issues that the vendor was able to find with the platform, um, whether they make the platform seem appealing or not. It needs to be an honest assessment because if a user knows that there is an issue with keyboard focus, then they might be able to find a way to work around it. But if they don't know about it because it's not in the report, then they're going in without being armed with that information. So looking at the ACR, considering what the vendor is claiming, and then testing those claims are the ways that we can hopefully try to avoid purchasing software that's no good to begin with. But again, if you're not in that position to make those decisions, what you can do is start gathering that information. Open up a Word document and jot down all of the issues that you had um, in this little 5-minute test. Your keyboard focus wasn't being tracked. Buttons weren't clickable. They weren't accessible to the keyboard. When you zoomed in, this thing happened. Um, Color contrast doesn't look right. When I insert images, the focus indicator gets stuck behind them. Or when I insert an image, I have to go through too many steps to find out whether I can add alt text or not. Anytime that an accessibility tool is buried and hard to find is kind of a yellow flag. It says that accessibility wasn't really the priority or is bolted on after the fact. And when your learners are involved, you can't take bolted on after the fact uh, because they have real world productivity needs. They have real world uh, issues that they're encountering every day already. And we're just adding to the taxes that they're paying, the disability taxes that they're paying. And we need to stop asking them to pay for somebody else's accessibility debt. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now. If you want to continue playing around with that, certainly feel free to do so. There is a survey at the very end if you want to click through it eventually. You don't have to do that now. Feel free to stick around after the webinar and complete that if you'd like. But we'll go ahead and move on for now. Um, so how do we take all of this information that we've gathered and actually push it upstream? I talked a little bit about this before, but it's about stakeholder management and managing up. Um, like I said, data don't tell the whole story, and oftentimes data are easy to ignore. Again, if we tell somebody that 1 in 4 people has a disability and um, they that we need to build for that audience, that doesn't really seem to drive the needle when it comes time to those conversations where somebody's like, well, accessibility is just too expensive, or we don't have disabled users. So when that happens, that's where we gather the qualitative data, the stories from people. We tell them, um, this was the issue that I had when I was testing it with just my keyboard. And I only spent 5 minutes doing this. Imagine what somebody who only uses the keyboard had to go through. If you feel like sharing my story, like no HIPAA violations here, I just shared it with you. So feel free to anonymize it or use it. Tell people the story of somebody who has actually been through a course that wasn't accessible and how they actually had to have somebody else who was paid more money to sit there side by side and make it through this compliance training with them, especially in the areas of compliance. Every single user has to go through this. So there's no excuse for inaccessible content. Um, it's not okay to just say, well, this is an optional course, so we don't need to worry about accessibility. I'm not saying that you should do that, but I'm saying doubly so in a compliance course. Um, People up top, people in leadership need to hear those stories so that they understand why it's such a big deal, because those types of courses move the needle more than the optional courses. It's just one fewer um, argument that they can make against creating accessible content. And again, I don't want your learners or you to be the one holding the bag, to be the ones paying for that accessibility debt that somebody else has incurred, or for paying that uh, for having that accessibility time and those resources to have those taken from you because a procurement team didn't understand the due diligence that they needed to do to avoid buying inaccessible software to begin with. Um, I'm actually very curious, and this is another thing that you can drop into the chat, to hear where are you specifically in regards to the power dynamic in making decisions about the software in your industry? Yeah, just use your mouse. Funny story there, Jennifer. I actually had just recently, I was doing a an exam for my master's program, and it was a proctored exam. So I had to have somebody on the other end of the computer, screen sharing, watching me do what I was doing. And I couldn't access the course. Like I could do the course once it was open, but I couldn't get to it from the browser that they had required me to use for security. And the proctor on the other end was like, "Well, can you just click on this thing?" And I said, "No, I'm a screen reader user. Uh, I can't click on that. Like I need to be able to tab into it or arrow into it." And they didn't get it. I've had another proctor tell me, "Can you please turn off the speaking on your computer?" And I said, "No, that's my screen reader. That's the accommodation. Um, I cannot turn that off. So you're just going to have to deal with it." Um, Honestly, it felt kind of nice to push that back on somebody for once, even though they're just doing their job. But there are going to be people who push back on you and say, "We don't need that," or "Why can't they just?" And "why can't they just" isn't um, that's not a solution. That's deflection. "Why can't they just" is accessibility theft. That statement is accessibility theft. It's saying, why can't you, the learner or the user, uh, take your time, give your emotional tax, pay your burdens? I'm not using those words in the right order. I apologize. Why can't you take the burden on yourself to deal with the content that we messed up? That's accessibility theft. And if you ever hear "why can't they uh, just know that that's again, that's a deflection. And when you start trying to build solutions for those deflections, you are paying their accessibility debt for them. Instead of pushing back and saying, "Well, why can't we just build it more accessible to begin with? Why can't we just take that on so that our users don't have to?" That's the solution to the problem. That's not pushing off the problem on somebody else. So we spent a little bit of time today discussing what accessibility theft is. Um, we talked about how we can do some really quick and simple tests to understand when it's happening or to gather data to push upstream to push back about accessibility theft. I'm wondering now, again, what questions do people have that I can help answer? Or if you wanted to just, again, share some experiences and maybe brainstorm some solutions, I'm happy to do any of that. We've got a little bit more time left, about 20 minutes, where I'm happy to answer any specific questions.
Jacob, this might be a good time for me to bring up what I mentioned earlier about in the
Yeah,
last session, where I think the question was on, like say on a website or something, if the, oh, what was it? If the text described what an image, gave a good description of the image, whether or not that image should still have alt text in it.
yeah. That's a really great question, and I know it's one that a lot of people often have. Um, so alt text is more of an art form than a science. there is a lot of nuance to it, and it always depends on the image in context of the content that surrounds it. Like Nicole said, context matters, and the goal is not to be redundant. So if the image is already describing something that's in the text, then you can mark it decorative. If it's just a shape on the page, please mark those as decorative. If you're not really sure, and the image doesn't necessarily repeat what's on the page, maybe it's just a graphic that you included. From my perspective, like feel free to give it some simple alt text, two or three words, just a sentence. Um, for me personally, as a blind user, I'd rather you include alt text on something that didn't need it than to not have alt text on something that really did. Um, with the exception of rectangles and shapes. So use your accessibilities tool in Storyline to remove rectangles from the reading order, please, because those will read every single one of them. But generally speaking, you don't necessarily have to worry too much about alt text. Use it when you add an image. If it's uh, really just designed to add visual flair and you don't think it adds to the context of the page, you can mark it as decorative. Nobody's going to necessarily fault you for that.
Excellent.
And Louise, if you don't mind reading a couple of the questions from the chat.
Sure. Yeah. I haven't gotten any questions. We have some posts here. Like here's one from April saying some people are just uninformed, as I was in
Yeah.
earlier years. I give credit when someone responds positively, when an accessibility user or advocate takes the trouble to explain. But it's not fair for the burden to always be on people with disabilities to make the case for accessibility to people who should be better informed.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's very similar to topics of diversity and inclusion, where we shouldn't be asking and demanding emotional labor from people who we expect to benefit from it. So to put that more simply, don't ask your disabled users to be the only people telling you what's broken. Now, if you voluntarily include a question on the forum and they choose to spend their time to answer that question, it's because they care. But don't take that as implicit um, permission to just go ask somebody that you know who's disabled to test something for you and say to check all of your designs for you. Um, and if you do ask somebody and you have the resources, please pay them for that work because that emotional labor is has value. But generally speaking, it's best not um, to ask that of people when it's not their job. We should be the ones educating ourselves. And there are plenty of people who are doing this work. There's no excuse to push it off on people around you when there are webinars, there are conferences like this one, there are YouTube videos that can help teach you about accessibility.
Nice. All right, I've got a couple more that have come in. Jessica Hausholtz is saying, someone shared a link to the review you did on Mindsmith. Are there any other authoring tools you've reviewed? I'm looking forward to reading your review of Mindsmith. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. I have reviewed many other authoring tools, and I'm just going to put it out there now. There aren't any that pass with flying colors. Um, there are some that are better than others, I'll say. So as much as I don't love to promote Articulate because of the price tag and some of the practices that they do, Articulate Rise really is one of the most accessible out of the box, but you do need to know what you're getting into because there are certain patterns, like their micro learning course, that is not accessible. Um, Storyline makes your life difficult as a designer to make things accessible. You can do it. Um, and yeah, the step-by-step templates. There are a lot of templates in Rise that you need to kind of learn, like what can you use and what do you need to just avoid using altogether. Um, I've tested Easy Generator and Squirm Stack, and they've both had some issues as well. Um, so I wish I could say that I wholeheartedly endorse one, but I don't, which is why I'm actually building the platform that you all just interacted with because um, I'm kind of tired from a blind learning designer's perspective of having tools that aren't doing the job. Um, but in the meantime, if you took Nicole's, or if you were in part of Nicole's webinar yesterday morning, and you want to vibe code something and build it to be accessible, that's a really great way to do it because vibe coding, there are tools like Claude that are just fine. Like maybe they're not perfect, but they can get you there. Maybe you have to spend some extra time on it, but you're doing that with Storyline anyway. So can you build an interaction that is more accessible out of the box and more flexible? Um, so that's kind of where I'm turning right now is vibe coding, mostly because the tools themselves are leaving a lot to be desired.
Nice. Okay, here's one from Jim Bueller. How much description should be on an image? Like, say there's multiple people, a table, a podium, a tablecloth, a piece of paper on the table, and a flag in the background. Do you want to know all that in the alt text?
That is a beautiful question. And again, the context really matters. But in general, when you're describing a scene, less is better. Um, I try to aim for maybe 125 to 150 characters max. So, what are you actually doing with the image? Are you trying to describe a group of people in a boardroom, a group of people at a table, um, a diverse group of people sitting around sharing drinks? Um, those types of things that's plenty sufficient, like those short descriptions. If the intent is to say, label uh, the place setting, because it's a part of an etiquette course and you're describing table etiquette, then yes, you want to do a long description in addition to your shorter alt text. Have long description on the page that gives you a written description of where the forks are located in reference to the plate, where the cup sits. That's an example of when the detail matters. But if the detail doesn't matter for context of the course, you can leave it out and just describe in very generic terms.
Nice. Jim
You're
follows
welcome.
up with a thanks. Yeah. All right. Yeah, Nicole's mentioning that Jared is going to cover Rise later in the week. And Jared is great. He presented last year too, I believe.
Yeah.
And let's see here. I'm not seeing anything else. Let me just back up a little. Okay, here's one. This just came in from Sasha. Um,
Okay.
Seeking advice, question for Jacob. When during the trial period, vendors ask, test it and report. And then it ends up my team doing all QA for them. And we are not procurement
Mm,
team, just a group of distance ed support folks involved in Ally ID and EdTech, et cetera. Feels like it's an unfair practice where you're selling me the tool that you didn't thoroughly test. Always perplexed whether to even report basic things to them that they overlook. Yet if I don't, it is unfair to my team institution to play it as everything is working great. I guess what I'm trying to ask is where is the fine line between keeping vendors liable to inclusive, accessible product and having the burden fall on the purchaser?
that's a great question. And that's a prime example of accessibility theft. They're trying to ask you for your emotional labor. So, for the same reason that we don't ask disabled learners to be the ones responsible for reporting all of their uh, the issues that they encountered directly to us, we shouldn't be giving that for free to vendors. Um, I don't know what the relationship is in this particular case. If it was a vendor that I'm evaluating as part of like a proposal process, I wouldn't give them specific feedback on what we found that was broken. I'd say your tools don't meet our standards and just close out the RFP. Um, if you have an existing relationship and they're genuinely asking you to report issues, then it's up to you to decide whether you want to pass on any of your user feedback to them. Because you're right, you are giving them, sometimes it's valuable feedback, and sometimes it's them asking you for more than you should be. If they, if the situation was reversed and the vendor said, we have been hearing reports of this type of issue, can you corroborate that? Or do you have any data that might help support that? Or have you been able to reproduce that? I might give them 5 minutes of my time to double check it or to look through my logs and see if somebody's reported that. Um, but if it ever feels like you're doing their job for them, that's a giant red flag. And if possible to sever that relationship, I would sever that relationship. Um, I would never enter that to begin with, if at all possible. Uh, and then does that help answer the question?
Okay, and yeah, it's also followed up with it's been happening more and more with vendors lately. Oops, and it disappeared. Let's see. It seems like the cycle's becoming so repetitive, it's emotionally exhausting.
Yeah, I think that a lot of vendors are aware of something like Section 508 compliance, and vendors know that they need to have an ACR or that they may be locked out of the room entirely. Like I said, if they can't demonstrate that their platform is accessible, then they shouldn't even be part of the proposal process. Now, vendors are incentivized because of that to provide an ACR that has false claims. Um, they're exactly that. They're asking people, or they're trying to push through their ACRs and hoping that nobody knows how to test it. So our defense against that is to know how to test it.
Yeah.
And if they don't know what an ACR is, um, you know, the salesperson on the conference floor, honestly, they should be aware. We should be equipping our salespeople with that knowledge. But if they don't, then at a minimum, once you actually reach out to their sales team, um, like with follow-up questions, somebody in that pipeline needs to know what the ACR is. If they don't have an ACR, then the answer is just no. And if they do have an ACR, and you, the the question is, can you give me a copy? And then it's, can I test this ACR? It's never, do you have an ACR? Yes. Okay, we check the box and we go.
Okay, excellent. Let's see. Yeah, I'm seeing Kimberly's mentioning the LMS that she had issues with. Um, okay, Jennifer's asking, your tool shows fantastic issues that are a red flag. When you test an ACR, what are your biggest criteria?
Hmm. Before you even start testing, when reviewing an ACR, you need to check if um, the scope of the ACR, so like what they say they're testing, actually lines up with what you're buying. So this happens with, I'm just going to give a spoiler alert for the Substack article I wrote. Um, the Mindsmith ACR says they're testing, I think, app.mindsmith.ai, which is their authoring tool platform. But then they say that their learning experience is accessible. But then the ACR also says that the shopping experience is accessible, and it's not even a shopping tool. So if the scope, which is that app.mindsmith.ai, or the URLs that are provided, or a description of the platform, if that isn't aligned with what you personally are buying, so if they're scoped, and just the e-learning tools and you're buying the platform for, I don't know, the LMS side of things, then that's a red flag. Or at a minimum, it's a sign that they're not aligned with your needs, that the ACR isn't aligned. And then uh, the methodology, if they can't show you the method that they use to test, if they don't have an accessibility contact, so some team or email address that you can reach out to with questions, those are all red flags that I would look at before I even began looking at whether or not they claim to support accessibility.
Jacob, how often do you get approached by vendors to do work?
Um, Not super often for me personally, but I have been asked by a number of clients that I work with to test a vendor's products. Um, so I think I mentioned earlier, I've tested a lot of authoring tools lately, and that's because we had one of my clients was trying to evaluate several options. Um, so I've had some experience with a lot of the different providers in the market, and not as much experience with the vendors directly.
Okay, awesome. Okay. All right. Taking a look here. April added a comment about Microsoft um, doing a bit of good work. Um,
Yeah, Microsoft has always been like they're not perfect, but their software is often they aim to be accessible more often than not. I appreciate a lot of the effort that they put forth.
yeah. All right. Any more questions, everybody? We've got like a minute or so left. Jacob, thanks so much. You are an incredible resource. How do people get a hold of you or contact you would be the best way?
Yeah, I'm available easily on LinkedIn. Let me see, can I put that in chat without sending it only to want to give it to everyone? Everyone.
There you go.
And I think my caps lock key was on, but that should still get you there. It's linkedin.com/n/at Jacob-Wood-Writer. That's the best way to reach out to me. You can send me direct messages. You can also email me directly at jacob@jacobwood.me. And I know it's not wise to put my email address out there for everybody, but feel free to reach out if you need anything. Again, I don't support the idea of emotional labor, so I'm not going to answer all of your deepest accessibility questions one-on-one without being entering into a client relationship. But
Right.
if you do want to reach out to somebody who does consulting, feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to talk to you about my rates and such.
Right. No, it definitely seems like if vendors do reach out to you, that you should be compensated for any of that
Absolutely.
feedback that you're offering them. Excellent. All right.